Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so happy to see that each of you are here tonight. We have been so fortunate in having this type of a program every year. We bring people in to tell us all about our Smoky Mountains and the Smoky Mountain area, and we're just so proud to be able to put on this program. And we appreciate so very, very much how much time that Jerry Ware and Veta King put into this in obtaining these people that we love so dearly who were born in this particular area to give us more knowledge about our own Smoky Mountains. I will not take a lot of time here. I would like very much for Veta to introduce the panel today, and I will sit down. I'm just so pleased that you're here. Enjoy yourself tonight. I know you will, and we'll talk after it's all over. Thank you very much. Veta King.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. I'm like Bob. I'm not going to talk a whole lot because we want to hear from all these folks at the table. But Aunt Kate handed a book to me the other day when we were talking, and this book touches on so many different things. This poem that's written by Gladys Trenholm Russell, that I wanted to read that, and maybe that'll kind of get us off to a good start tonight. And then Jerry's going to introduce the panel. But like I say, this touches on so many things that it'll kind of get us kicked off. It says, remember 50 years ago in the Smokies. Do you remember first hearing over 50 years ago that mountain folks must sell and find a place to go, and how real estate men came swarming in and took us to counties where we'd never been, how we packed up and moved even the old tow sack, but our mountain life memories we didn't have to pack. Now it's fun to go back and stroll among the trees, remembering lots of little things such as these. Do you remember chestnut and muscadine hunts, or slopping the pigs and listening to the grunts, eating ham and gravy and big cat heads, sleeping warm and cozy in a big feather bed? Eating a persimmon, and it probably should be simmon, eating a persimmon and wishing you had not, or riding a mule bareback at a fast trot, toting in wood or fetching a bucket of water, or getting stung by pack saddles when pulling fodder, shucking corn and a mouse running by, or stumping a toe enough to make you cry, washing the dishes and dish rag fights, picking blackberries and getting chigger bites, hoeing corn and sweat bees stinging, hearing evening concerts of katydid singing, taking milk to the spring to cool in crocks, rail fences, paling fences, or fences made of rocks, hunting a jar fly singing up high, or making soap from ash hopper lye, closing a bumblebee in a hollyhock bloom, sweeping the floor with a homemade broom, tying a string to Junebug's legs, feeding the chickens and gathering the eggs, eating squirrel dumplings or possum pie, waving a newspaper minder to scare away a fly, digging the potatoes or picking wild greens, making sauerkraut or pickling beans, putting the new hay crop into the barn, getting up before daylight ready to hoe corn, grinding coffee beans in wooden box mills, taking salts or castor oil to cure your ills. Do you remember a dip of Granny's snuff, or that one drag of rabbit tobacco was quite enough? And I'm not old. I'm almost 40, but I've smoked rabbit tobacco, so. and you don't get high either. The kerosene can with a tater on the spout, a carrier on horseback for the mail route, handmade toys, a whistle, a flip, a wagon or sled, making a fire in the cook stove to bake cornbread, oil lamps, split-bottom chairs, and a hog rifle gun, strings of pepper or beans and drying apples in the sun, driving the cattle down a winding trail, milking a cow and getting swatted by her tail, all-day washings and scouring the floor. The ironing with black irons was really a chore, churning to the tune of Come Butter Come, or rocking the baby to a lullaby hum, wearing long underwear with a trapdoor, women's skirts and petticoats reached near the floor, bib overalls, high-top shoes and Sunday hats, shuck or straw bad ticks and fallen slats, brides riding in tubs, grooms on rails or poles, wondering whose death the church bell tolls, toting a lantern at night to miss a snake or mud hole, shoutings at church and baptizings when cold, the oiled schoolhouse floor and dirty bare feet, a poke or lard bucket with a biscuit lunch to eat, a tablet and a penny pencil bought with eggs, and at the little store men sat around on kegs. Remember home remedies for colds, cuts, and scratches, and folks didn't like clothes with sewed-on patches. These are remembrances from the Smoky Mountain scene, an indelible imprint, all indelible imprints on my life through 16. And that was by Gladys Trenum Russell.
God sure did give us a nice place to live with all these beautiful mountains and these trees and the wildlife and the nature streams that we have in this area. But there's another treasure that we have, and that's what we're here tonight for, is to celebrate that treasure. And that's the people who live here and have made it home for about 200 years now. And those memories that they have, we would like to save as much as we can and pass on to the next generation. We have 4 panelists with us tonight who are descendants of some of our earliest settlers, and then we have one special lady who decided to come to help us out here in the mountains in the 1920s. She came with the Pi Beta Phi group to set up schools to educate our children and help us with a new future. But before the traffic and all the tourists made their way here, these people came and they found these mountains, and they have lots of stories and lots of things to tell you. And I'd like to just sort of say something about each one of them. I'm gonna just mention their name, and then I'd like for them to tell you who they are, who their parents were, and what part of the area that they lived in this county. Our first panelist, Kate Beck, is from Boogertown, which is not too far away. And Kate, would you please tell us who you are and about your parents and something about where you were raised?
Well, I was Kate Watson Beck, and my parents, I think both of them were born in North Carolina. My mother grew up over there at the Indian reservation, and she just really loved the Indian people. She'd tell us things about them, and it was real interesting to hear her talk about her life when she was young and about growing up. And then my father, I don't know what part of North Carolina they were, my great-grandfather was from, but he was born in North Carolina. And they met, though, here in Tennessee and were married, and they were married in 1899. And I was born in Boogertown in 1916. And my father died when I was just 3 years old, so my mother had 7 of us to take care of and to try to raise. And of course the boys were getting old enough to help her with the family, and so they moved out to Fish Camp, that's above Elkmont, out on the logging job that had started out there. And the boys that were old enough went to work, and my mother kept boarders and so forth. And so I just had a really interesting life growing up, and our mother taking care of all of us.
And tell us where Boogertown is.
I don't know.
Well, tell us how you get there.
It's about 6 miles over from Pigeon Forge, I believe. It's called, the church there is Oldham's Creek.
Oldham's Creek. So if anybody's looking for Boogertown, it's at Oldham's Creek.
No, you'll find it better by Boogertown.
Oh, okay. Okay, our next panelist is, her family's been here probably the longest of any of these, our panelists. They came down from Virginia in around 1870. And that's Miss Hettie Paine, and we happen to be on her family farm. She was born just across the street in the White House, if you notice it beside Ruby Tuesday. But Miss Hettie, would you tell us about Pine Grove? Your situation is a little bit different. You didn't quite consider yourself a mountain woman. It was more like a little different, wasn't it? You want to tell us about your ancestry and how they got here, and something about you and your parents? And
all right, Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen. I was born in this old White House down here, the Montgomery home, in November on a Sunday morning. And my parents were George W. and Sally Cameron Montgomery. And I feel like I'm very much at home because this, where I'm sitting right now, was part of our farm at that time. The farm went all the way over from the river. That was where the ford was. There were no bridges until 1915 down there, only swinging bridges on the one that's in Pigeon Forge and the McCown Bridge. And then after that, I attended, well, first, I guess I'll have to ramble just a little bit, but when I was 1 year old, my parents took me to Texas. We live 15 miles north of Dallas, and I was there until 19 and 15 when we came back to live with my grandparents. They were getting old in this house where Mr. Flynn lives right down below us, and then I lived there and I attended Pine Grove School. Well, I had been in kindergarten and had first grade out in I was in school at Addison, Texas. That was about 5 miles from Dallas. And the schools there were much better than our Tennessee schools. I'm going to brag a little bit and not bad-mouthing the place. But anyhow, when I came back, I had had I'd had kindergarten and first grade. And I was to the place where I didn't need to have the first grade, so I went on to was promoted to the second grade. And in Pine Grove, we did like they did most places. We had pie suppers and spelling bees, and the one whoever stood up the longest, why, that was the winner. And that was an interesting thing. And then, of course, we went to church and Sunday school, and that time Shiloh Church was built. And I attended church at Shiloh, but I went to school at Pine Grove. And my first year was not very pleasant. It was a relative of mine teaching, but she didn't know much about teaching, and I was the only child in school. Maybe I didn't either. I taught 13 years. But anyhow, she I was the only child in school that wore glasses, and she let them make fun of me. I was called bad eye and specs and all things, and I had a miserable life my first year, but thank goodness school was just 5 months long, and I didn't have to have her long, and I got through with the school, and I'd tell Mom I was sick and stay home though a lot of times. And then I went after that, they had what they called a pay school. School were just 5 months long then, and a sweetest woman from Pigeon Forge came down to teach school. Some of you may know her. She died just some few years ago, and her name was Anna Murphy Roberts, and she lived with the people that lived just above us in the Davis house, which was 2 houses above where we lived. And I'd walk to school with her, and oh, she took me. I don't know why she liked me, but she did. And after that, my life changed, and I had no more trouble in Pine Grove School. But there was one thing I learned back then. We had on Friday afternoon, well, of course, we took our lunches. I went home because I lived close enough I could go home for my lunch, but a lot of children took their lunches, and then we, of course, they had the dipper to drink out of, and out in a little pump and outside. And then we had these 2 teachers that taught there that were very fine. They decided we would have a literary society that on a Friday afternoon, and they would invite the patrons in, and we'd have some kind of a little program. And whoever was elected president sat up on the stage and presiding, and I guess I was always talkative and got an office in something, or was always into something, and I was the first president. But that's where I learned my parliamentary procedure back then when I was just a little girl in about the 7th grade at that time.
Okay, our next panelist is with us, is Mr. Harvey Oakley. And he has a very, very famous father. He might want to tell you about, who, if you've seen out in the lobby, Roman and Reston is a book that his father, a collection of his father's stories. But Harvey's got quite a few of his own, but I'd like for Harvey to tell you something about himself and where he was born and his family. Harvey?
First of all, I'd like to say that in Gladys's book, they call us hillbillies, but we're really not hillbillies, we're mountaineers. I like to be a mountaineer instead of a hillbilly. My father was a pretty famous guide. He guided all kind of Ernie Powell, Kate Smith, Henry Ford, and he guided all of the fathers of the park. Colonel David Chapman was one that he had a lot to do with, and I have a brother named after Colonel David Chapman. He was known as the father of the park, and just now, I was born way back there, and he was born back at the foot of Mount LeConte, and I was born back there in an old log cabin where you could have to take the daubing, you know, when we'd move in, why, you'd have to daub them up in mud to keep the cold out, and just old, and then we'd take these old newspapers and put them up on the wall to keep them freezing to death in the wintertime, and there was 12 children in our family, but they wasn't all in the same cabin at the same time. Most of the time it's just the one. When we first started out, it's a one-room cabin, but then they'd add on a kitchen later and get one of these old step stoves. And I remember Mother, she used to cook in the fireplace on one of these old, I guess one of these old Dutch ovens. You'd rake the coals over, you know, and boy, that cornbread, it tastes good. Rake the hot coals over it, and we lived back there really in the mountains. And
What was the name of that place? Was that?
well, where
It's sort of an unusual name, wasn't it?
well, the one about back Scratch Britches,
I thought Scratch
and the store, the cow barn store where Bill Landry took the video of my father and mother when they moved to Scratch Britches Mountain. That was the last house back there from under the foot of Mount LeConte. It was back, I've been back to the old place back there where they moved to Scratch Britches Mountain. Went back there and the snow was on the ground. And it's, you know where the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail goes around to the head of Baskins, kind of in there? Well, right down, you just walk down that hollow there just a little bit, and the old cabin's still there. A lot of the logs are still there, but the roof's caved in. Most of it's gone, but there's a lot of it still there. I was in there back about a winter or two ago, and went in there to see it. That was known as Scratch Britches Mountain. That's where my father, when he got married, he moved back to Scratch Britches Mountain, and he said it. Well, Bill Landry has got a video of it in the Heartland series, and it's about the cow barn store, and I've got it in this book here. Dad wrote 2 books, and he couldn't read or write. See, my mother and Daddy, neither one couldn't read or write. He wrote this book, and he said all he put was a period. That means catch your breath and start reading again. Said he didn't know where those colons and semicolons belong, so all he put was a period. That means catch your breath and start reading again. And my mother, old home place was a Noah Bud Ogle place, and we were raised up around in that section up there, you know, the Noah Bud Ogle place. I'm sure you all familiar with the Noah Bud Ogle place, and I remember staying there and visiting there a lot, quite a bit. I was kind of small at that time, and I remember my Granny Bradley, Cindy Bradley, she said, what, got up for breakfast, and she said, what do you want for breakfast? I said, I want a fried egg. She just pushed that little shutter open there on the side, went between the 2 buildings, and the chickens laid eggs in there the day before. She's cooking down there on the fireplace, one of them old Dutch ovens like I was telling you about, and she just reached out there and got egg that the hens had laid the day before, and she just popped it down in that pan. I had breakfast in just a little bit. And I remember in front of the fireplace around Christmas time, well, she'd take plenty of them old puncheons, you know, that you put on the floor, and she'd take them up there and had a dirt thing to run around, you know, like that, made out of mud and rock. And she kept her potatoes, and she'd have apples in there at Christmas time. We had a lot of apples. I remember out, she would, had a lot of apples up Cherokee Orchard, up in that section, at the foot of Mount LeConte where we lived, and we'd fix these apples on, you know, dry them on hot rocks, and in the wintertime, I remember, in the wintertime, we'd can up everything, you know, and to eat, you know. If you didn't make it, you didn't eat. You'd starve that winter. And I remember used to take these string beans, you know, green beans, and to run a needle and a thread through them, you know, and you'd have big strings. She'd hang them up in the attic in the summertime, and they'd dry out, you know, they just rattle and shake. And wintertime, us kids we'd eat them, but boy, they was good. They'd taste a little leathers, you know, like you's eating leather. Just eat hull and all. It tasted a little leathers, but boy, they was good when you was hungry.
Okay, our next panelist is Janavee Ownby, and she's from the Glades community. She's one of our crafts ladies, and I'll let her tell you something about herself, her family, and some of the things that she's learned from her family that's passed down from generations, if you would.
Okay, my father was Oliver Ogle, and my mother, Cecil Ownby Ogle. My dad, he grew up in the national park. Most of the time he lived on Dudley, and sometime, well, I think he lived on Round Top and then on Dudley. And then when the park took it over, why then, you know, they moved out to the Glades. And so my mom, she used to live on Paine, and then they sold out there and moved to the Glades. And my dad, he was a farmer and a woodworker, and like worked at sawmills and some helping build houses and things. And my grandfather Ogle, William Elson Ogle, he used to work on Little River and the lumber, cutting timber and stuff, and he, I think, well, Dad said he carried the mail some when they'd moved back to the Glades or somewhere. And my grandmother, she was a basket maker. She was one of the real fine basket makers. She did a lot of the egg baskets like this little basket, and then the wall baskets like this. And well, she just made a lot of different kinds, and she made fans. And back in those days, you know, you didn't have air conditioners or anything, so the fans made out of white oak was real good, you know, to use the fan with on the hot days and all like that. And my grandfather Ownby, well, they lived at, excuse me, I've had the flu, and I figured I'd get till I couldn't talk. They lived on, see, when they moved to the Glades, he bought the land there, what's now Ownby Hills. It's a big subdivision there, but he is a farmer and a school teacher, and anyway, my great-grandparents, they lived on across what is now Hidden Hills, and my great-grandfather, he was a Baptist minister, and my great-grandmother, she'd spin and knit and do all kinds of things like that. So I guess that's about what my grandparents did.
Okay. We, our area was very isolated. You couldn't tell it by now, but there wasn't many people coming and going in the mountains. A lot of the people came through Virginia, settled here. They took part in the Battle of Kings Mountain. That was the major Revolutionary War event here in the South. Most of them came through Virginia and settled at Watauga, and then a large contingency from Greenville and Watauga marched to Kings Mountain to defeat the British there inland. when they returned here to these mountains, they became sort of isolated. Around 1830, there was a major migration to the west. We don't exactly know what happened, but the population dropped by about 1/3. And from 1830 to the Civil War, it was a real isolated area. The people who settled here were very supportive of this country, because most of them their ancestors had fought in the Revolutionary War. And when the Civil War broke out, in the 1850s, 60s, they were strong sympathy to maintain the Union. They formed groups to fight for the Union Army, and of course this was a state that seceded. So there was not a lot of support in Nashville or any part of the rest part of Tennessee to help this part in East Tennessee. These people were mountain people. They were very fierce, very independent, had lots of pride. Their pride was their family. They had lots of love for their family. But they had some areas that that had fallen away. By the early 1900s, there was a definite need for education. And there was a group of people who came who saw the need for these mountain folks to reestablish good schools to educate these children. And they saw something here special. They saw the craftsmen that we had, the native craftsmen who did the weaving and the basket making. Because these people had been isolated, they were accustomed to making everything that they used. So every farm basically had several different shops and things. And fortunately, this group, it was called the Pi Beta Phi sorority, saw the need to help establish schools. And we have one of the first teachers of the Pi Beta school, and I don't think she'll mind me saying Harvey was one of her students, I believe.
Well, I'm one of her students. She may tell you I'm the meanest one.
Miss Henrietta came here. She wasn't married, and I'd like for her to tell you something about herself and what her first impressions were when she came to this out-of-the-way community, Miss Henrietta.
Well, I was born in Canton, Missouri, which is 150 miles north of St. Louis on the Mississippi River. And we lived there until we moved to St. Louis when I was a sophomore in high school. And I went through college in St. Louis. And a lot of people might wonder why I came to Gatlinburg to teach, which very few people knew about Gatlinburg at that time, because it was an isolated community. Well, the reason I came, I was a Pi Beta Phi in college, and I went to a convention and saw a movie of the school and decided that was what I wanted to do. So I applied. Even though I planned to teach math in high school, I told them I would take anything that was open. So they wrote back that I could have the 4th and 5th grade. So I came by train in August of 1928. And when I got to Knoxville, had to buy a bus ticket to, well, I called it Sevierville. But I found out it's pronounced Sevierville. So when I got to Sevierville, I had to get a taxi to Gatlinburg. And Mr. Whaley brought me out in a taxi, and I was a little disappointed because the clouds were hanging low and I couldn't see a mountain. But when he took me to the school, he let me out at the gate and took all my luggage out and dumped it and left me there. So I walked up to the teacher's cottage, which is also called, well, can't say the name. Anyhow, Miss Pollard was there, and she was one of the first teachers. Now, the school had been in existence 16 years. I wasn't the first teacher.
I said one of the first, not these.
And Miss Pollard was one of the first teachers, and so she took care of me and saw that my luggage was brought up to the cabin. I stayed in Stewart dormitory. There were 3 dormitories for the teachers, and they all came from Pi Phis, from most all of them, not all of them, but most of them were Pi Phis from all over the country. And so when I got there, I expected to find lamps and outside restrooms, but I found out they had electric lights and they had commodes, and I was real tickled. But one teacher came later. She sat down and cried. She was disappointed that it was so modern. But anyhow, but one of the teachers, a new teacher's, was Alice Williams, and she was from Illinois. She had the 5th and 6th grade, and she was worried about teaching math. I said, well, I'll take your math and you take my grammar. So we traded one class. That was before that took place very much. And I did have Harvey, and he was a good student too, and he didn't give me any trouble. And I had Earl Ogle, and I had the twins, Blanche and Bruce Whaley, are some of my students. I also had Hal Reagan, but he was called Burles then. His first name was Burles. I think Harold was his second name. He evidently didn't like Burles, so he changed his name to Harold, or Hal, as he went by. But I will tell this now or tell it later.
Tell it now.
How the school happened to get started.
Just tell her.
Okay. The Pi Phis, at a convention in 1910, when I was 4 years old, they decided they wanted to do something to honor the founders of Pi Phi. And Pi Beta Phi sorority was founded in Monmouth College in Monmouth, Illinois in 1867. So they wrote the national, our government, and tried to find out where a school was needed the most. They did want it to be something in education. So they wrote back and told them Kentucky and the Appalachian Mountains, Kentucky and Tennessee, really needed help. So someone told them that Gatlinburg, Tennessee really needed it the worst. So this grand president of Pi Phi went to see the town, and she took a train. She went to, like I did, and then I want to read her letter. Where is it?
While you're finding that, I sort of want to share something too. I know some of the mountain folk were sort of suspicious of this group called Pi Beta Phi. They didn't really know what that was, and some of the parents didn't want their children going there because they thought they were going to teach them some unknown religion or something. I believe. Is that true?
That's true. And they also weren't cooperating too well with Ms. Helmick, who was she was the chairman of the settlement school and the one who really got it going well. And she was from Chicago. And she finally told the people that if they didn't help get the land and raise the money to help, and the Pi Phis would give the majority of it, that she was calling a hack the next day from Sevierville to come and they would leave. So Mrs. Huff called her husband and they sent for him. He was a lumberman, my father-in-law, and he was 8 miles at his lumber camp. And he came and the men all got together and they started out. They first brought a paper and had her sign what they needed to do. So she did go see Mr. E. Ogle to see if they could buy the land, and he said he would sell it for $1,800. and that's where the school was built. So they started out, and the next day they came in, they had the total amount. They raised $1,800, and the Popeyes, $1,200, and the Popeyes gave $600. So they gave a third, and the local people raised 2/3. And some gave 5, some gave 10. Mr. Huff, and some of them that had more, Mr. Huff gave 250, and C. Whaley gave 250. And then it went on down to 100, 50, 10, 5, just many people. And that deed is in the county office with all the people's names that gave and how much they gave right now, today. So anyhow, I want to read you this one letter. Thought I had a turn to it.
The Popeyes played a very important part in saving some of the crafts that we have, and they also helped develop the crafts and spread them to other communities. Our people had the natural talent to do that, and they shared those experiences around. So I think that's one of the things that you see.
I thought this would be interesting to hear.
Okay.
Got to have some water. The Popeyes appointed 3 members of Grand Council to go in 1910 to visit the community of Gatlinburg. When the day came for them to go, it turned out that only 1 member could make the trip, Dr. May L. Keller, Grand President of Pi Beta Phi, quoting from her report. At 6:30 a.m. in Knoxville, Tennessee, I took my seat in the single-passenger coach of a train drawn by a diminutive engine which burned wood. We puffed, snorted, and panted our way to Sevierville, the terminal of the toy road. Mr. Drennan, county superintendent, one of the best, finest friends our school has ever had, met me and drove me to the hotel and left me with the assurance he would call for me the next morning at 5 and drive me to Gatlinburg. There was a community without school facilities and without the prospect of attaining any. Early the next morning, Mr. Drennan appeared in a small light buggy. Of course, there weren't cars then, not many. His greeting was, "I'm sure glad you came," and later added, "You have that healthy look, which would be necessary to sustain you over 17 miles of the worst road in Tennessee." At that time, there were no bridges, no road to Pigeon Forge. We forded the creeks up to the floor of the buggy. The road followed Bird's Creek. We stopped to visit several schools. The first at Glades, the usual one-room structure. All the children were dressed in calico, were barefooted, but had bright, intelligent faces, and they were clean. The trouble with the schools seemed to be that very few teachers have ever gone to high school, and they are teaching the same grade work they had done themselves. At Gatlinburg, we made a halt for dinner, and a more ideal situation I have seldom seen. There is quite a valley here, cup-shaped, entirely surrounded by high mountains, and the houses cuddle down under the mountains. And they served dinner. And when we wished to pay for our meal, our host refused at once, saying that he was interested in education and was glad to entertain us. A mountain man who had taught several years and appeared unusually intelligent came up to the house to talk to me. In reply to my questions, without a moment's hesitation, said, "Put the school in the mountains if you really wish to reach those who cannot obtain an education. Put it in town if you wish to train teachers only." So they did decide that Gatlinburg was the place to go. And in 1912, they opened the first school. But I'll tell you more about that later.
Okay, we would like for you to take about a 5-minute break, and then we will go back and start telling some stories, and then we'll give you a chance to ask some questions. I know some of you may need to stand up for just a minute.
I put me down some questions. Yeah, so, because I didn't know, you know, we talked about how do people learn the crafts? Did they learn from their parents?
Yeah, I'll
or did
let
they
you
learn
have
from-
Sure would love to
Can you
have
say
one.
something?
They sell them at the district center up at Sugar. And then they sell them at
What do they do? You know,
Related to George?
Yeah, I know. They sell them at the Resort and Center and them two places.
I have a brother, Richard, she's right back there.
George's wife lived in Sevierville, and he was dying of cancer. Yeah. And he went into remission, so we were building a house up on the Providence.
They hired, yeah.
And I asked him if he would build a stairway, because that was, he was really good at that, I'd heard. So he came out, and I think that's the last job he ever did before he died.
He's got the high,
Gone back to Fort Lauderdale, and my wife had a bunch of key limes, and she brought them up here and squeezed juice, and she made 2 big key lime limes. We took them to George, and he was in bed that day, and he never, we were there for 2 weeks when he got back, he passed. But you look so much like him on the face.
I think her name's Mary Jane, and I just met her a time or two.
They give them water.
Thank you, sir.
See you? Good to see you too. You're very interesting too. Boy, I could tell I could stay here all night.
That's why everybody here did good.
I live in First
Think of his first book, Rise and Fall of the Pine Grove.
That's right.
He gave me a copy.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we will begin,
A lot of that,
continue our program. If everyone will please have a seat, we'll get right back into our program, please.
Short 5 minutes.
I didn't even get to tell about my husband. I'm not through yet.
While we're taking our seats, I would like for everyone to understand that each of the experts that we have had all year long, along with these lovely people, are donating their time for Wilderness Wildlife Week. And right there in itself, I think, should be something that we should not ever forget. And let's give them a hand on that, please. I also want to say very quickly that we are taping this event this evening, so that is the reason for all the cords and things of that nature, and I hope that hasn't, well, it has not bothered you all a bit because you're doing beautiful. So I wanted to make sure we have cords all around, so please be careful when we do take a few minutes break. Excuse me. Jerry?
Okay, what we'd like to do now is something a little bit less formal. We've sort of let you meet these people, and they've told you a little bit about themselves. But some of the most interesting times talking with any of our panelists, unfortunately I get to talk to them before you get to talk to them, and they tell me some wonderful little stories about themselves or about something that they've known. And we were talking just as we came in the door about a young lady who was wanting to get married, and I'd like one of our panelists to tell that little story for us. And anybody else on the panel, if you have a little story or something interesting that you'd like to tell about yourself or something you know about the mountains or any topic, we'll do that. But and then I think Harvey's brought his guitar. He wants to play some mountain music for you and some of the old songs. Would you like to tell us about your neighbor?
Story?
Yes, let's hear about your neighbor. I think that's
Well,
a good...
I don't know if she was, anyway, I just knew of her. She's kind of, well, she lived in the same community I did. But anyway, this lady, she was getting up, I don't know, 40 or 50 or something. She had never been married. And she'd go up on the hill and she'd pray for the Lord to send her a husband. And she'd just go up there and she'd pray and she'd pray. And one day she went up there and she was down under this big old tree. And
and she got down just to pray, and there's a big old hoot owl up in the tree, and it started hollering, hoo, hoo. And she said, just anybody, Lord.
Would you like to tell us about Dory?
Well, I don't know too much about that. I've got the book, and her daughter wrote the book, and it's very interesting, but I'd love to tell about a little story about when we moved out of Boogertown. We left Boogertown and went to fish camp. We moved, and we was having to go through Gatlinburg into Elkmont, and of course there wasn't no bridges up there. And we rode on the wagon up to Gatlinburg, and then my mother and me and the other Blanche and Bob got off and went across the hill. It was closer that way than to go around the road. So when we got to Elkmont, my mother had packed us a lunch, and of course she had some bread. And we got out there to the river, and there wasn't any bridge across the river, of course, and this cow was following along with us. We took her cow with us, and she had never seen a river, so she wouldn't go across that river. I tried to get her over there, and so my mother finally went across the footlog and got over on the other side, and she had some bread. The cow's name was Girl. We always called her Girl. And she got across the river and held that bread out and said, "Come here, girl." No, the cow just went through that river. So we took her cow and went on up to fish camp.
Hey, Kate, why don't you tell the story about Granny killing the hog?
My mother.
Oh, yes.
That's when she was a young girl. This was in North Carolina, and everybody let their hogs run out over there. I don't know how old my mother was, maybe 10 or 12 or something. But anyhow, she went to get her some mulberries off the tree, and she climbed up in the tree and shaking these mulberries off, and some farmer's hogs come and was eating her mulberries. And she tried to make them get away, and she couldn't, so she got down out of the tree. She says, "I will get you to get away." So she picked her up a rock, threw it at the hogs, and one rock, she killed one of those hogs. And she drug it over in a ditch, kind of, and she's afraid to tell it because... And the man that owned the hogs, he came to the place where my mother was staying, and he asked her if she'd seen the hogs when she was at the mulberry tree. And she said, "Yes, I seen them." Well, he said, "I know that Renta couldn't have killed that hog because she couldn't have drug it off, but she scared so bad she did drag it back." She didn't ever tell him about killing the hog.
Kept that a secret.
Kept that, yeah.
Miss Hettie, you've got a story to tell us?
I don't know anything but reminding him of killing something. When I was a very young girl, my mother had gone somewhere, and I decided I wanted a fried chicken. And I was a member of the 4-H club, and so I went out and I thought, well, why will I ever get this chicken killed? And so I picked me up a rock, and of all the things, would you ever know, I pinned its neck just right under the fence. It was a barbed wire fence. And there I had the chicken, and I dressed the chicken, and I had fried chicken.
Harvey, have you got a story you'd like to tell us?
Well, I guess I better tell one. The first time we moved out of the mountain, way back in the foot of Mount LeConte, see, I was born back there, born with a midwife. And when I went in World War II, and I got my birth certificate, and she couldn't read and write, evidently, because she marked me up as a female. I guess I ought to just joined the wax instead of the Army. When we moved out of the mountains, we moved way back in there, we moved down to Gatlinburg. And Dad had so many kids, we couldn't get a place to stay, you see. And Colonel Harvey had this haunted house. I call it a haunted house, see. Nobody would live in it. There's a man killed outside, and they took him in on the porch and murdered there. And it was right where Zoder's Court is now in Gatlinburg, where the mouth of Roaring Fork comes out into Little Pigeon, right there. And it was right there where Zoder's Court is now, I remember. And we moved in, and over across the creek, there was an old mill. And they'd been and there's a coffin factory in it. And they'd disbanded it for years when we first moved there. And us kids went over there, you know, and these old coffins is upstairs. There's a mill just like Mingus Mill, if you've ever been to one in North Carolina. Just like the Mingus Mill over there. Had a big old 4-bay come down, it went down and they turned things and made these coffins. It'd been disadvantaged, you know, for a long time. Us kids went up, and we got up in the attic, you know, up there where the old coffins was, made for the mountain people. And a little round glass about like that. And one of them get in there and look up through that glass in that velvet, you know, and another one would preach his funeral, you know, beat on stuff and preach his funeral like the mountain people did. Then finally we decided to make good boats, you know, so we took them down on the river, right there close to the river. We got in, we were floating around the river, and when we got through floating, us kids did, well, we put them out on the bank, you know. Then when we went home, we was going to come back and ride them some more. It come a flood up in the mountains, you know, and those coffins went down the river and down Pigeon Forge. They said it's washed the graveyard away up Then we'll go back to this haunted house, you know. When we first moved in, it was over on where Zoder's Court is, but the mill was over on that side. And I think it got to be, you know, those coffins, everything over there, they'd been disbanded and left for a long time, you know. And we moved in there, nobody else had moved in. The first night in there, well, I was smaller, you know, and my brother was a little older than me. They said, okay, all the rest of the kids will stay downstairs. But Ian, me and my brother would have to sleep upstairs. And we went up the stairs, and it wasn't finished ceiling up there. The ceiling was up about that high from the floor on one side, and the other side about the same way, and it wasn't sealed on over. And we got in bed, and we would dare go to sleep, you know. After a while, we heard this swish, swish, bump, bump. We looked over and seen something wide moving around. Down the stairs we went, boy. Just as hard as we could run, we slept on a pallet on the floor with Mom and Dad the rest of the night. Next night, it was our job to go back up there. So we went back up. We went back up, and Dad gave us, we didn't have no flashlights back in them days. He gave us a big box of matches, you know, them old kinds, great big ones, like great big sticks on them, you know. And my brother sat there in the bed. We got in bed, and we didn't dare go to sleep. And he was ready to strike one of them matches, you know. Dad told us, said, strike one of them matches and see what that haint is. And so he got ready to strike one of those matches. We were laying there, and it was a long time in the night before it ever started again, you know. After a while, it went swish, swish, bump, bump. We looked over there, and something white coming along the wall like that. And it struck the match, and you know what the haint was? 2 big albino white rats pulling clothes. They was pulling clothes across the floor. And that was the haunted house.
Well,
I've got another thing I can tell about
well, okay, one more.
Roosevelt.
One more.
Go ahead and tell it. Okay, we heard that Roosevelt was coming to dedicate the park. Us kids did. Well, first I'll tell about up to the Calvin Ogle store. They said me and one of the boys, we crawled up on there. They said there's a grave up on there, and said what we heard, it was a slave of old man Gatlin who, you know, they named the city after him. You know, it used to be White Oak Flats. And so we decided, me and Melton Ogle, we crawled way up on there. And sure enough, there's a mound up there. And what we heard, it was on this floor. You just crawl way up on there. It's right where Calvin Ogle's store was. And they said it was
Highway
a slave.
321.
Yeah, 321, where you go around Orange Park. And they said it was a slave. And right over there was right over from it was Arthur Ogle's barber shop. And the roof, I think he'd added some on to it since these pictures back here, all these pictures we have, come down kind of like that. And it's about that high off the ground, I guess. And the roof come down off his barber shop. And we heard it, Roosevelt was going to stop right there. So we lived on down the lower end town, and we hurried up there, you know, and sure enough, we heard he was going to stop and talk to Maggie Parton. She'd woven Miss Roosevelt a hand-woven dress and sent it to Washington to her. So we hurried on up there, and well, I was standing right there. I was standing just about as close from here to that glass. When he drove up, was over on this side, over this way, over towards the barber shop, and the Mountain View Hotel was out there. I'd like to say a thing about the Mountain View Hotel. Andy Huff, he was always a good friend of our family, always had been. And he'd always give Dad the jobs, you know, to go into the mountains, you know, whenever he'd guide anyone. And Roosevelt come driving up, and he was that close to me when this lady standing beside him. She said, "Mr. Roosevelt." Stuck her hand out, and the FBI man just shoved it out of the way. I could reach over and shook hands with him too, see? But I know he's going to shake my hand. And another man jumped up here on the Arthur Ogle's barber shop. He had a camera and turned right down in his face like that. And this FBI man reached up there and got it and just looked it all and handed it back to him. Then he shot a picture right down there. And Roosevelt went on up to dedicate the part after he met Maggie Parton. That's the Roosevelt story.
Okay. Ms. Huff, maybe you'd like to tell us what kept you here in the mountains after your... What kept you here in the mountains?
Oh, okay. Well, I planned to come and teach 2 years. And I met a certain young man named Jim Huff and started dating him, and we got married. I taught 3 years, and we got married, and I didn't teach anymore because married women weren't allowed to teach back then. Did you know that? And but I had 2 daughters and a son, and then 2 more daughters, so I didn't ever teach anymore. But my husband he was in the lumber business when I married him, and he bought some land on the Parkway when the village blacksmith died, Charles C.C. Maple. Reagan, when he died. And then he built a motel after we were married. We married in 31. And in 37, he built a motel on that land. He also built a home for us there first. And he built most of them log cabins in keeping with the mountains at first. But they're all gone now, I'm sorry to say. Well, I'm not sorry either, I'm glad to say. And a motel, my daughters built the Hampton Inn. That's where the land was, right on the Parkway. I did want to tell about Jim. Of course, his father was Andy Huff, who built the first hotel in Gatlinburg. And like Mr. Ware said, Andy was a very wonderful citizen of Gatlinburg and did a lot for the progress of Gatlinburg. And he was on the first Hotel Motel Association, which was started way back in the early 40s, or maybe it was the late 30s. But from the beginning, Andy Huff was a strong supporter of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And 3 of the people who really got this park started was Mr. Davis, Willis Davis, and his wife, and Colonel Chapman. And it's told that Mrs. Davis went to visit the Yellowstone National Park. And when she got back, she asked her husband, why can't we have a national park in the Smokies? And so Mr. Davis became very enthusiastic, and with a small group of Knoxville businessmen, he organized the Great Smoky Mountain Conservation Association. And Mr. Davis was elected president, and Colonel Chapman was directed chairman of the board of directors. And of course, at that time, they went to the government and worked hard to get this. In 1925, the assistant director of the National Park Service, Armo B. Kammerer, came to Gatlinburg to make a study of the possibility of a national park. He stayed at the Mountain View Hotel, and he met with members of the Great Smoky Mountains Conservation Association, and one member, Miss Laura Thornburg, who I'm sure a lot of people might know, although time flies, and there may not be many living that knew her. She had a home on the hill, summer home on the hill behind the hotel, right above the hotel, and often went on hikes with Mr. Kammerer. She tells in her book, The Great Smoky Mountains, that Mr. Kammerer inspected the land that would determine the boundaries of the park. When he was ready to return back to Washington, D.C., my husband, Jim Huff, was a young boy. He was his guide over the mountain, and Mr. Kammerer had one person with him, so they rode horseback over the Indian Gap Trail over into North Carolina, and then Mr. Kammerer caught a train there on to the big city, where he got a big train on into North Carolina. And Jim spent the night with the Connors over there, and then came back and brought the horses the next day. I thought that was interesting. And also, Mr. Huff tried to get the businessmen of Gatlinburg to build 6-lane road through Gatlinburg when they built it in 34. And it was 1940, but they thought it was foolish. He could see what was going to happen, and he had a vision of what was going to happen here in Gatlinburg. And if only they had listened to him, would have been wonderful. But I did want to tell you one more thing, and that is that when the Pi-Phi started the school in 1912, they saw the need, financial need of the people. They did have orchards, and there were lumbermen, and Mr. Huff was in the lumber business and had several camps up in the park, where the park is now. But they saw the people that they could weave, and then they made beautiful baskets and furniture. So they urged, there was one woman came in it was early, 1915. She came, and she was a Pi-Phi, and she had graduated from a normal of crafts, and she brought tools. She bought tools, about $182 worth. They said, had 3 benches with every kind of tool you could think of, and she taught it to the boys, and the men came too. And she encouraged the women to get out their looms. They had quit weaving because they could buy store cloth, and them to continue with their baskets. And then they made a place to sell it. They had all the Pi-Phi alumni clubs all over the country. They sent this products to them that the people made. And then in 25, two young Pi-Phis came, and they wanted to start a shop. So Miss Evelyn Bishop, who was director at that time, and her father was president of Murphy College. Miss Bishop, some of you might know of her. And so they had a shop in the dormitory I lived in, which was Stewart Dormitory, down in the lower floor. And then they moved it to the teacher's cottage, and then the first school building was a small one-room building right on the street, right across from Charlie Ogle's store. And they used that building because they had built a new building in 1914. And it was a 5-room building. It was a building that I taught in when I went there to teach in 28. And so they started a shop there and had a Pi-Phi came to manage it. And that was how the aircraft shop started. And of course, they had 100 women weaving for aircraft shop when it was at its peak. And also sewed baskets and other kind of crafts. And I'm sorry to say that the aircraft shop is no longer run by Pi-Phi, but they want to spend all their time and effort in Airmont School of Arts and Crafts. I could go on and on, though, telling how that started and how now it's helping people all over the world, not just in Gatlinburg. So I believe I've talked enough.
Okay. Before tourism became the major industry here, lumber was really important as an industry. It gave the people, the young men, a place to work and jobs. There wasn't a lot of money. A lot of the workers and a lot of the people worked on a barter system. They would work for a family, and then they would get grain, or they'd get food or whatever, or they would trade off work to help each other. But the lumber industry was very important, and Andy Huff was one of the primary people in developing the lumber industry. And around the Sugarlands, he had a large sawmill there, and that community was even larger than White Oak Flats, which is now Gatlinburg, before the park came. Over at Fish Camp, though, at Elkmont was another major lumber area. Did your family work in the lumber business there?
Yeah,
Could you tell us something about Fish Camp?
Well, it's just, well, they did a lot of logging with horses and skidders and so on and so forth.
Yeah, this was Mr. Townsend's lumber company.
Yes, they hauled the logs to Townsend, you know, had a big sawmill down there, and they had timber cutters and men that run the skidders and the loaders and the Parker cars and all kinds of machinery to get their logs out with, besides the animals horses that they haul their logs with, and they hauled them on the train. When they got the railroads built back there, they'd haul them on the train to Townsend. And all three of my brothers worked there on the job, as they called it, and did different things, you know.
Okay. Well, do you have anything else specifically you'd like to talk about the Fish Camp, since that was a little different place out there than here?
Hey, Kate, why don't you tell about the way they moved the houses along the train track? I thought that was an interesting story.
Well, they just built boxes for houses, and they had a hole in the roof and one in the floor of the houses. It's about 14 feet square, I guess. And they could pick those houses up with a loader, they called it, and set them on the flat cars that the train pushed and pulled and so forth. And you didn't have to move your furniture and things out of your house. and they'd set you 3 of those in a row, fasten them together when they got them there. They was covered with tar paper. They wasn't nothing but a box house, and that was the company houses, so we lived in those. And you moved from one up, when we lived on Fish Camp, that was the first place that we went to when we went out there, moved out there. And then we moved back to Elkmont. When they'd get the timber all cut in one place, they'd build a railroad up another place, and they'd move the houses, pick them up and put them on the flat cars, and the train would haul them, and they'd set them off the side of the railroad. And we moved to Elkmont and stayed there a while. Then we moved to Jakes Creek, and they logged that out. And there was a terrible fire there when we lived on Jakes Creek. It was a dry summer, and the woods were dry, and the timber that they'd cut, they all just got the logs, you know, and left the limbs and so forth, and when it'd catch a fire, it'd really burn. And then we moved from Jakes Creek down to what was called Wildcat. We had some names. And that was below Tremont, is up from Townsend, and then they called that the middle prong of the railroad. They had to have a name so you'd know where you were going. And then we moved on up toward Lynn Camp, and we lived in a place there called Stringtown, and they had, I guess, 15 or 20 houses on each side of the railroad. It was about 10 or 12 feet from the railroad, your house was. And so they had that on each side of the railroad. They could set the houses, and that was called Stringtown. That's where I remember the most. I went to school at Lynn Camp. And then we moved back to the other prong when they built a railroad up it, and it was called Blowdown. Because it'd come a windstorm through there and blown some trees down. That was Blowdown. And then we moved back to Tremont, right above where the store was. And in some of those books I've got over there, there's a map that shows where the school was. I went to school to each of these places now where we lived, and the last school I went to was there at Tremont, and that's where they'd build a stationary house. When they'd build a house that they couldn't move on the train, that was a stationary house. And so they'd built one. They had a movie, then theater in it, and we had school in it, and we had church and Sunday school in it too. So the one house did serve for the purpose for all three of those things, and they had a store there. And then they built a hotel there at Tremont, and people could come and spend the night in it. But most of the time, you just everybody kept boarders that when the men had come in for jobs and so forth, and you'd keep boarders, and that's the way my mother helped to raise us kids, was keeping boarders, and then the boys working at the job too. And so when we left Tremont, we moved back out to Booger Town.
Aunt Kate said that when she, at Elkmont, or fish camp and the places, said you didn't walk anywhere but what you walked on the train tracks. Is that right?
Yeah.
And said when she moved out to Pigeon Forge, everybody took the same distance and steps like they were stepping on the train tracks. It looked a little strange when you're walking on a sidewalk or a paved road, I guess.
You get tickled at yourself for taking such long steps. You know, you had to reach those ties.
Came in habit.
Yeah.
Now, all the logging at that time, I believe, was clear cut, wasn't it? They just clear cut everything,
Yes.
and then just
Anything that would make a broad foot of lumber. Well, they'd cut it, and somehow or another they had it. I don't know how they did it, but they'd have people to go and clear some land there, and they'd sow some grass and so forth, and so they'd homestead that land, and then the company would take it over. I don't know how they done it, but somehow like that. And then when they started the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, well, they bought the company out there at Townsend, and of course they had about all the timber cut anyhow at that time.
see, now that belonged to Colonel Townsend.
Yes.
And his company. And then the other part toward the sugar lands and up that area, above the community would belong to Champion Fiber, and of course there's no houses up there, and that's how the park got most of that land, was from Champion Fiber Company. Anybody else have any stories about the logging? That was a real important one. One of the things that interests me about some of the panelists, they have some real interesting facts about them that are sort of unusual. And I know some of these things that you have seen, but you really didn't know where they came from or who did them. But I know if you've been in the park for the last 10, 15 years, you always see these wonderful signs about the park that describes the place that you were there. And they have, they're painted, they're routed out and painted. And you wonder, where did those come from? Well, those came from this man right here. He made those signs. He might want to tell us something about those signs that we have all over the park.
I worked for Smoky Mountain National Park till I retired. Had 33 years service with, worked 3 years too many with my service time. I made all those routed signs, even the entrance sign, trail signs and all. Then they went to try to let the prisoners make them down. When I retired, they let prisoners start making them down in Atlanta, Georgia, but I don't like those. I think they ought to, well, they went back now to the old routed signs. I made in North Carolina, made all these entrance signs up here and trail signs and all of them. You go around in the fall of the year and just take a roller over in my scrapbook, which I brought along tonight, got a picture of me rolling little signs in the fall of the year. And I used to, while I was in there, that was I retired by that job of sign maker, but before then I worked a lot on trails, started out on trails, then I worked on the old log buildings in Cades Cove and helped repair all of them. And I remember helping the mill and Jungle Brook, now, not Jungle Brook, but the North Bud Ogle place, where that's my mother's old home place. The Ogles, you know, and she was one of the Ogles, the first Ogles in Gatlinburg. And I got a picture here when we met Henry Ford with the old Ogle building. It was up behind the Chamber of Commerce. I got a picture of part of it here. It's got a little of it in there with my dad and Henry Ford, a picture taken in this book.
What happened the first day he came to visit? What happened the first day he came to visit?
Oh, he came to visit us. My mother had a little old shop down there at the lower end of Gatlinburg where we lived, and Henry Ford and his wife, Clara Jane Ford was her name, his wife's name. And my mother had a little old shop there and had a newborn baby, just born. And Miss Clara Jane wanted to hold the baby, so she held it. And she said, "What's its name?" So we always name them after famous people. You know, I've got a brother named after David Chapman, the father of the park. And so she said, "Doesn't have a name." Said, "Let's name it after you." So she named it Clara Jane Ford Oakley. And I'd like to say that Father, the Roman man, he guided a lot of the people back there when they was just blazing the trails, you know. Now the Rainbow Falls trail went up that way. You just went right up the creek all the way, climbed up over the rocks out on the Mount LeConte. And then he worked, he helped back then, you know, blazing trails. He helped blaze the trail down from Mount LeConte to Indian Gap Road, down in there, back in the old days, and helped a lot on the Appalachian Trail with the Appalachian people. And
I wanted to tell one more thing about the park. Miss Andy Huff, when they needed a place to make their headquarters, the park, in 1932, they opened a cottage on the Mountain View Hotel grounds. And then Andy Huff added a room to make it large enough. And that was the first park headquarters, was on the Mountain View Hotel property. And also, he built a new home for the first park superintendent, J. Ross Aiken and his wife. And in the same area on the hotel grounds, he furnished another cottage for the offices of the Bureau of Roads plus a home for the superintendent of this bureau. And that was the park office for 8 years until they built the new park office in February of 1940. And then it was moved out of the hotel. But the hotel was really a bustle of activity with all the park officials and all the tourists too. And he built the large hotel on the front in 1930. So this all happened after he built the large hotel.
I've been told, I don't know if this is true or not, but my aunt told me this story a long time ago, and I've always thought it was such a funny little story. Andy Huff was working on the hotel, and of course he had this beautiful idea, this fireplace at the back end of the long hall when you went in the main door and it's back to the right. And he had asked Ernest and some people to work to build this fireplace, and Ernest was pretty young, but Andy let him have the job to build the fireplace, and he built the fireplace and got it all fixed. And he said, and Andy came in and said, Ernest, now do you think that chimney's going to draw? He said, yeah. He said, well, are you sure? He said, well, sure. He said I put some wood in there and struck a match and lit it, and said, all of a sudden I turned around, I heard the noise behind me, I looked over there, and your cat was scratching on the floor, and all of a sudden it just went right up the chimney. So now I don't know if that really happened or not, but that's a story I heard about my uncle building.
You better yodel on that.
I better yodel on that.
My dad always yodeled on them tall days.
But evidently he's pretty good at building chimneys. Harvey, would you like to, I heard you were invited to the World's Fair in New York. I don't know what year that was.
Oh, we all
1933.
We used to play a lot of string music back in the old days, and the Chamber of Commerce sent us up north to put on some shows. So we traveled up there. We stopped all the cities up east. We played it. My dad went along with us, and he'd give talks on the mountains and everything, and we'd play string music, and we played the National Folk Festival in Washington, D.C., and we went on to the World's Fair in New York. Oh, when was that?
1933.
1933, I guess it was. And played at the World's Fair up there, and then we played all the cities up east.
What? Could you play one of those songs, or one that you'd rather play?
If you want to.
Well, we might
Time
as well.
sets our kids.
Yeah, 5 after that. Kate says that she'll sing with you if you play something she knows.
You sure can't say that.
Top of old Smoky, all covered with snow.
He's playing that for me.
What about the biscuit song?
The biscuit song.
Mirandy did sing.
On top of old Smoky, all covered with snow, I lost my true love by courting the snow. Courting is pleasure, but parting is grief. A hearted lover is worse than a thief. A thief, they will rob you and take what you have, but a cross-hearted lover will take you to your grave. The grave, it will hold you till your body's turned to dust. Not a boy in 10,000 will do for a girl's trade. They'll hug you and kiss you. They'll tell you more lies than the cross ties on the railroad, than the stars in the sky. It's raining, it's hailing, and the moon gives no light. Your horses can't travel this dark, stormy night. Go put up your horses and feed them guide me what time you have to say. My horses aren't hungry and they won't eat your hay. I'll travel on farther and I'll feed on my way. I'll travel to Georgia and I'll write you my mind. For my mind is to marry and leave you behind. On top of old SMOKY, that mountain so high, where the wild geese and the turtle can hear my sad cry. On top of old SMOKY, all covered with snow, where I lost my true lover by courting too slow.
Okay, what we'd like to do now is just to open it up, and if you have questions of any of the panelists, we'd like to take those questions and answer some questions that you might have about times past.
I have one question. Why couldn't a married woman teach?
I'd like to know that. I guess they should be home taking care of their children.
No reason, Mr. Rule.
Maybe that was the reason. It was a state law.
I think that was the intent, that a married woman with children need to be home taking care of her children.
Still do. We also had very...
Okay, right over here.
Well, Jacob was my brother-in-law, and he started the lodge on account.
I thought not the same as one you met.
What? I said he was my brother, my husband's brother.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sir.
I just boogered down man.
There's 11 tales about how it got its name. The one my mother told me was that somebody came down from the glades one morning early, and it's before daylight, and he seen a white-faced cow, and he got scared at it. So he went back and told him there was boogers down there in that hall. So that's my tale about Booger Town.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question for Kate Beck.
Kate.
You said that you had school in all those places that you moved to. Where were the teachers from? Were they right from the community?
Well, one of them came out there from Pigeon Forge and taught. She used to be Grace Smeltzer, and she was a teacher at Lynn Camp. And just people that had been, well, she had been through high school and came and taught. And then there was a lady from Townsend taught the last year I went, Miss King. No, well, I went to Eula. Eula taught 2 or 3 years there, and they were all pretty good teachers. They knew what they was talking about.
I enjoy your columns in the paper when you had the one where different place names originated. Where did Pigeon Forge get its names?
Pigeon Forge was, the Indian gave the name of the Pigeon River. The Indians gave the name of the Pigeon River because there were so many passenger pigeons that lined the river, and there was an iron forge located along that river. And the two just kind of merged, I guess, over the years, didn't they, Jerry?
Yes. It was called, you went to the forge to get any of your, you get your horseshoes made or any metal tools that you made if you didn't have your own furnace and they called them shops then. If you didn't have a shop, you went to the forge to get it. So it was the forge at the Pigeon River, so they called it Pigeon's Forge.
I had heard somewhere about these were carrier pigeons.
There were carrier pigeons, and the forge, the anvil from the original the forge that was here, is at the Butler's the Apple Tree Inn, and it's still there.
And you used to be at your Uncle
Yes,
Bob's.
it used to be at Uncle Bob Ware's farm. He'd kept it for years, and he donated it to Senator Butler when he built Butler's Farmhouse Restaurant, and then when they sold it to the Apple Tree Inn, the forge, the original forge that our city's named after is at the Apple Tree Inn.
Jerry, you might mention a little about your house over there at the city park and what we have over there with the Indians and all of that. Why don't you mention that a little bit?
Okay, if you'll look at the exhibit in the back, you'll see we've got several things, some historical items left from about Pigeon Forge in the area. You can see them over on the left. This area was first settled by Colonel Samuel Ware, who I'm a descendant, and his home place was built at the city park, which is just across the road from this area. The Montgomery settled on this side of the river, and the Ware settled on the other side. He built a block house there, and then in 1790 he built a large house. He brought carpenters in from Virginia, and some of the logs, the structures are still, we have them, there's at the McClung Museum, but if you'll notice the wood back there, they cut down large heart pine and they marked them with Roman numerals after designing the building and fit them together. They had their own brick place where they made their own bricks, and the house, most people think that the mountain people first settled in brick and log cabins, but that's not true. It was made of board and brick, and they had glass windows, and we have a picture of it. But the city park is built around the site, the graveyard is preserved, and the house site is preserved, and we're going to be doing an exhibit at the tour center hopefully in the next few years so that you can see that too. The Montgomerys came and
built in 1918 and 66, just right after the Civil War. My grandfather was a captain in the Civil War, and I should have told too that he gave the land for Pine Grove School, was one of the first teachers there, and he taught there, and my father taught there then in 1898.
Right, and her grandfather was a captain in the War of 1812, and her great-grandfather Alexander
the Revolutionary War.
Was in the Revolutionary War, and his son was born in the fort. That was one of the stories.
My grandfather fought in the Civil War. He was from Ohio.
Ohio.
Alexander and Colonel Samuel Ware, they were together in the Revolutionary War, and they were good friends. And our house was built on this side of the river, and theirs on the other side, and they continued to be good friends. And then during the Cherokee Indians, and when they had
that was 1795
massacre, why my great-grandfather, took his wife, who was pregnant over, and the first child was born over there. Sevier County.
I wanted to ask you, Jerry, I see signs Fort Ware. Is there a real Fort Ware, and Ware's Valley? Is some of your family from here?
Cemetery.
The fort was built just, you know where the city park is?
Yes.
The baseball field on the south side is where the original fort was built. He built the fort there in 1781, and then it was torn down and moved when they built the city park. They'd converted it to a barn, but the original logs were there. Fortunately, those logs were taken out, I think, and sold to a police officer, and he built a cabin in Jefferson City that has some of the original logs that were from 1780 in them. The original house, then, that was built in 1790 was demolished when the city finished the park, and a lot of the logs went to the McClung Museum, and we have some that's going to go in the local museum. But the State Historical Society has declared that area a historical site. So the lower section is buried under about a 3-foot mound of earth, because it was built what we thought was on an Indian mound. We thought it was Cherokee, but it turned out to be pre-Cherokee. It's Mississippian. So there are also Indian mounds in that same location, so we're hoping to preserve the whole site. We do have some Indian relics over here, some stones that were used for toys and tools that came from the site, and we want to put those on display for the city.
Well, is that how Ware's Valley Road got its name?
Not really. Ware's Valley was settled by Mr. Percival and Mr. Crowson, Aaron Crowson. Aaron's daughter, Mary, married Robert Ware, who was the son of Colonel Samuel Ware. He was a surveyor, and so he surveyed the Wares Valley, and then, of course, then he inherited a large farm there. So he gave the name, his own name to it when he surveyed it. He called it Wares Valley. By just right, it should be called Craftsman Valley, probably, because the Wares really settled here in what's Pigeon Forge. This is where their family, where the houses were.
Thank you.
I wonder if anybody in the panel has a comment about Paul Adams.
Paul Adams.
Yeah, he went to Mount LeConte, didn't he?
You're the first.
Yeah, he Dad was up there when they blazed the first trail down towards
And
Indian Gap.
1926, the American.
He had a dog, didn't he?
Yeah, Jack.
Yeah.
American Association of Advancement of Science had their meeting here on the con in 26, I think.
Yeah.
That's when Jack started his lodge up there, 26.
He had this dog he would send down to Ogle's store, and he'd take groceries back up, wouldn't he? You heard about that?
They didn't take any meat.
To add to that, Ernest helped build the first ones with Paul Adams. Ernest over my husband.
He was the one who built that super chimney that sucked that cat right up. In the Mountain View Hotel.
I hadn't heard this story before.
I was with him down there and said one day he's going back up and he saw a groundhog, and he had eggs over it, you know. And said he Jack the dog, you know. His dog's name was Jack. So Ernie said he just gathered up that sack of eggs that was broken and put them on a rock and went on it.
Jerry,
Ernest a lot because Ernest was coming to court. Ernest was coming to court. Brought the dog and the dog.
But he got scared of wolves and didn't do it.
Wasn't any wolves then.
I've got a question for Janavee about some of the early crafts people. What did they make their crafts to sell or to barter with, or did they learn from their ancestors, or did they learn from the Pi-Phi group, or both?
Well, a lot of the real early ones, they just made their things for their homes and things to use, and well, like they made their furniture and stuff, and they made baskets just to use. Everybody, you know, they'd carry the eggs, you know, they'd take the eggs to the store and sell them. They'd carry them in the egg baskets, you know, and then they'd get their groceries. When they bought them, they'd just carry them back in a basket instead of putting them in a bag or something.
Did they barter with the baskets too? I mean, like if you needed something from somebody else, did you make your neighbor a basket?
Well, yeah, they did, and well, my dad was a chair maker too, and they would, well, sometimes, you know, somebody'd get married and they needed some chairs, he'd just make some for them, and maybe they might swap out sometimes, you know, he'd swap them chairs for something they had. And
do you remember who some of the earliest craftspeople were in Gatlinburg?
well, a lot of the McCarters and Ogles and Huskies and just different ones. Mac McCarter, he had one of, I guess, one about the earliest shops. He made chairs and baskets and so on, and my husband's grandmother, Sally Compton, she was a sister of Mac's. She was Sally McCarter Compton, and she made baskets. She would go stay with them. They're I guess, about the first little shop in Gatlinburg, or, well, I guess E.L. Reagan might have been the first one, but anyway, Mac McCarter had this store about where Tranum's store was out in the lower end of Gatlinburg. And they made chairs and baskets and so on. Anyway, Lum's grandmother would go and stay and help make baskets. And when he was a little boy, he'd go with them and stay and work on it. They'd make baskets and so on.
The Pi-Phi's was open in 27 on the street.
Okay, George?
I want to ask Harvey, do you remember exactly what year it was when President Roosevelt came to Gatlinburg?
It's 1940.
First of all, I didn't hear him.
Roosevelt came to Gatlinburg.
1940.
Oh, 1940.
September 2nd.
1940, I guess.
Yeah, 1940. I was 2 years old.
We don't know the answer, we'll get it, won't we? Thank you.
Somebody knows,
I meant
don't
to jump about the first
Other questions? Yes, sir.
homemade in
My wife and I do a
Gatlinburg.
lot of fishing up at fish camp and have pretty fair luck some days.
Yeah.
And I wondered if it was named that before the railroad went up there, and during that time, was it a ladylike thing to do to go fishing?
Oh, yes. I'd go fishing with my aunt that lived up there. She could catch 'em, buddy. But it wasn't named, there wasn't anything there before the railroad went in there. There wasn't even a trail in there, I don't guess. But they built the railroad in there, then the people moved in, you see, and they named it Fish Camp. I don't know why, but they did.
Because there's so many trout fish, I guess.
Question for Miss Beck. In the first place, you had those string cabins, string towns along a railroad track. How in the world did you stand the noise of those engines?
Well, they didn't go that often. They'd go up in the morning and back in the afternoon.
And then another one, where'd you put the borders at 14 by 14?
Oh, well, there's an explanation. You had, when you kept boarders, they'd put you a lobby, they called it. They'd set one room of that off from your house, and you put bunk beds in there. It could sleep about 6, I guess, in one room. So there's where your boarders stayed. But they came into your house and ate, and they slept in that lobby, they called it.
Yes.
In the book, Dory, you mentioned before, the mountain woman, she mentioned that she was born in one of those box cars or something in Tremont. Was she there when you were there?
Yeah, she and I are first cousins.
Oh, okay.
And she's in the book, if you...
I'm that Kate in the book.
That's Kate in the book, Dory.
Our mothers were sisters. Her mother's the one I'd go fishing with. Dora's mother was the one.
But we'll do commercial right now. This book, Dory, is in the local bookstores, and it's an excellent book. If you haven't read it, I would suggest that you read it. It does have a lot about the mountain ways and the mountain people, and the author, Mrs. Bush, was one of our panelists 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's what I heard her when she talked, and when she started mentioning about the Tremont. I wondered if it was...
Yes, I went to school with her children, you know.
One more commercial. Finally, our Sevier County history book will be here next week. They sent us. They flew this to me tonight, but it's not been bound. It's just the pages. But they say they're working on it, and it will be here next week. And it has stories, I believe, about everyone in this panel, plus many, many others. It'll be on sale, and there are green slips back there if you'd like to order them. It starts with our Indians settlements here. We've got a varied history. There were many peoples here before the Cherokee, and we have a section on for them all the way through to local history, and including Dolly. So I would like to recommend this book to everyone. It's Sevier County, Tennessee, and its heritage.
How much?
It's $59.95. Pretty expensive. Okay.
I don't think Mr. Oakley ever told his daddy's name. He kept talking.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to tell us who the Roman man was? We didn't mention his name.
Yeah, you can get these roaming man of the mountains. You can get those at the
Still ain't into
Visitor Center or Welcome Center below Gatlinburg.
And who wrote it? Who told the story?
Wiley wrote both of them. There's 2 books, Roaming and Resting.
Wiley Oakley.
Roaming man of the mountains. And he had a picture of Henry Ford over there on the back. Go ahead.
I brought some books because it has good pictures, and it is really a history of the community. And this is now called Mountain Ways, and it's written by Gene Aiken, and it has all kinds of pictures way back. And it is a good history book, really and truly. He wrote 2, number 2, the same thing. And then I also brought this Smoky Mountain Family album, and it's written by Gladys Trenholm Russell. And she grew up just a little ways from where the park office is. It's before you cross the bridge on the left side. And I visited her. I've been to her home, and she went to the Pi Phi Settlement School, too, as a girl.
I'd like to say our family is in the Gene Akins books, both of them. All of our family is.
Okay, the Historical Society also has two books that you might be interested to learn more about Sevier County and Sevier County people. One, The Gentle Winds of Change, which is a more modern history of since 1930. Is that the date? Since 1930 of Sevier County, which is a very good book to read. And the other one, if you're doing genealogical studies or family studies, the cemetery book, In the Shadows of the Smokies, is also another good book. So we encourage you to look for books that our local people have written about ourselves. A lot of people from outside come in and try to tell you what we are and what we're like, but I really believe that these people up here can tell you best what we are and what we're like.
You've got. Go ahead.
How about Conley Husky?
Conley Husky.
He was the magistrate when they found the Bogart swindle in Champion's Fiber.
Yes.
Park.
Anybody?
No, Conley Husky.
I know it, but I don't know. There is a book. I do. His son in there, a representative now. And I knew his wife.
Her Conley Husky. We got all sorts of Conley Huskies. That's a trouble. It's a trouble here, too many of us have. We just died this winter.
You had a question in the very back here, I think. Did you?
I didn't see.
Anybody know anything about the CCC camp?
CCC camps.
I know my father was in 1458 up at Sugar Land, and her husband was, my sister back there, Lucinda, and I remember visiting up there in the CC camp. Dad, he worked on these trails. I remember he was out helping with the trails, and they took it through Arch Rock. He took it through Arch Rock, which it used to go up to the Alum Cave the other way, and they took it through that Arch Rock, if you've ever been through it. He had him to detour over there and go around through Arch Rock.
Question.
Jerry, I just want to make a request before you all adjourn for Harvey to sing that biscuit song for us.
All right, we would like to say we really appreciate you coming. We hope that you come out again next year. We've really enjoyed it, and we're going to let Harvey sing the biscuits. What's the name of the song now?
Oh, it's Pass the Biscuits, Mirandy.
Okay, yes. We'll end with Pass the Biscuits, Miranda. My uncles, all my uncles were, and my grandfather were.
I did. I married one of those old CC boys.
Santa Claus been sitting on the rock, shooting everything inside. Now I shot a coy and a dozen mountain boys. This killing sure gives me an appetite. He said, pass the biscuit, Randy. I'm just as hungry as sin. Pass the biscuit, Randy. And me the softest of men. Then he heard the rifle crack and the bullet hit the shack. Another broke the dishes on the shelf. He grabbed his trusty gun, for the battle had begun. Knew that he must protect himself. He said, pass the biscuit, Randy. I'm gonna load up my gun. I'll use your biscuit for bullets. I'll put them varmints on the run. Then he poured a ton of black powder in his gun. Then he crammed the biscuits into place. Then he took aim. My goodness, what a shame. Bang, the gun exploded in his face. He says, darn your biscuits, Randy. I know I'm gonna die. Darn your biscuit, Randy. I knew they would get me by and by.
Ladies and gentlemen, is that not a treat? Is that not just wonderful? We thank you so very, very much. What an opportunity we have had this evening to hear such wonderful people and the history of our Smokies. We do thank you, thank you, thank you so very much. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. I know it's from their heart, and certainly from the city of Pigeon Forge. We do thank you. We have a little something for each of you tonight. And of course, we've given it to all of the experts that we have had during the entire week. We have a hand-carved, hand-painted eagle here for each and every one of you. Doug, would you give me a little hand here, please? Each of you will receive one of these eagles, and on the back of it has Wilderness Wildlife Week 1995. Place those on your desk, if you will, and remember us. We're also giving them a Wilderness Wildlife Week patch this year, and also a pin.
Thank you.
We do appreciate you all doing this so very much. The patches and pins, of course, can be purchased. There you go. Wonderful, wonderful. Take a picture of that, will you, please?
Thank you, sir.
We do appreciate it. We appreciate you all so very much.
Bob, if anybody wants to stay and ask more questions.
If they're all righty, we've just been notified that if you want to ask any more questions, the panel would be most happy to answer them for you. Thank you so very much. We do appreciate all of you being here, and do come back tomorrow morning. We have a lovely schedule for all day Sunday also. Thank you so very much. Good evening.
Any more lines than the cross ties on the railroad, than the stars in the sky. It's raining, it's hailing, and the moon gives no line. Your horses can't travel this dark, stormy night. Go put up your horses and feed them some hay. Come and sit down beside me, what time you have to say. My horses aren't hungry, and they won't eat your hay. I'll travel on farther, and I'll feed on my way. I'll travel to Georgia, and I'll write you my mind, for my mind is to marry and leave you behind. On top of old Smoky, that mountain so high, where the wild geese and the turtle can hear my sad cry. On top of old Smoky, all covered with snow,